The judge leaned forward, adjusted her glasses, and asked the boy a question that was designed, whether she meant it that way or not, to catch him off guard. The boy did not flinch. He reached past his father's hand, tapped the tablet, mounted to the display board, and answered her question with a number, a diagram, and a follow-up question of his own about tolerance margins that made her stop writing for a second. Behind them, a small cluster of parents had gone quiet. 6 months earlier, most of those same parents had been the ones whispering. If you've ever been underestimated by people who didn't bother to look closely enough to see what you were actually capable of, stay with this one until the end. This is the story of a father who spent half a year in a garage with his son, ignored every whisper that came his way, and watched a room full of judges go silent for reasons that had nothing to do with pity. His name was Daniel Foster, and he fixed industrial machinery for a living, the kind of work that did not leave much room for error and even less room for excuses. He was good at it, not flashy good, the kind of good where problems simply stopped happening on the machines he maintained. And nobody thought to ask why, because it was easier to assume things were just supposed to run that smoothly. He raised his son alone. Nathan's mother had left when Nathan was 3, not long after the diagnosis came in, and Daniel had never spoken badly about her in front of the boy, not once, in 8 years. He simply did the work of 2 parents and called it Tuesday. Nathan was 11 now. He had a mind that moved differently than other kids his age, faster in some directions and slower in others, and a way of looking at machines that made Daniel's chest tighten with something that wasn't quite pride and wasn't quite recognition, but sat somewhere close to both. Nathan did not make eye contact easily. He did not do small talk. He flapped his hands when he was excited and rocked slightly when he was thinking hard, and none of that had ever once stopped him from understanding a servo motor faster than kids twice his age. Daniel had learned a long time ago that the world tended to see the hand flapping before it saw the servo motor. That was the whole problem, really. That was the whole 6 months. Distilled down to one sentence. The idea for the robot started on an ordinary Tuesday evening, with Nathan sitting cross-legged on the garage floor, surrounded by a spread of loose parts that Daniel had brought home from a scrapped conveyor system at work. Nathan was not playing with the parts so much as organizing them, by weight, then by shape, then by some third category. That only made sense to him. Daniel watched from the doorway for a while before he asked what Nathan was building. Nathan said one word, arm. Daniel crouched down next to him. What kind of arm? Neither. Nathan pointed to a diagram he'd sketched on the back of a school worksheet, a rough sketch of a robotic arm with a gripping mechanism at the end, the kind of thing you'd see holding a welding torch on an assembly line, except scaled down to something that could sit on a table. Daniel had seen a lot of sketches over the years. Kids drew spaceships and dinosaurs and superheroes. This sketch had angle measurements written next to the joints. He looked at his son for a long moment. Then he said, "Okay," and that was the entire negotiation. There was a science fair coming up in the spring, hosted by the Regional STEM Alliance, open to any student in the district willing to put in the work. Nathan's school counselor had mentioned it in passing weeks earlier, more as a suggestion than an expectation. The kind of thing adults say to kids they don't necessarily believe will follow through. Nathan had followed through. He had followed through so hard that Daniel had to explain more than once that they could not start pouring concrete for a base plate at 9 o'clock on a school night. The project, as Nathan described it in fragments over the following weeks, was not going to be a toy. It was going to be a fully articulated robotic arm with 6 degrees of freedom. Controlled by a microcontroller, Nathan intended to program himself, capable of picking up objects of varying shapes and sorting them by size without a human touching the controls. Daniel did the math on that ambition and felt his stomach drop a little. It was not a bad idea. It was, if anything, too good an idea for a 6th-grade science fair, the kind of project you'd expect from a university robotics club, not a boy who still needed reminders to tie his shoes because the sensation of double knotting bothered him. But Daniel had also learned over 8 years that telling Nathan a plan was too ambitious rarely worked and never helped. What worked was showing up. What worked was clearing space on the garage workbench and saying, "All right, let's figure out where we start." So that's what they did. The garage became the site of a two-person operation that ran most weeknights and every Saturday. Daniel handled the parts he had access to through work. Servo motors that had been slated for disposal, aluminum stock left over from other projects, a second-hand microcontroller board he found for cheap online after 3 weeks of research into what Nathan's design actually required. Nathan handled the design and, increasingly, the programming. That part surprised Daniel the most, if he was honest with himself. He had assumed, going in, that he would be doing most of the technical heavy lifting, and Nathan would be along for the ride, learning as he went. It took about 3 weeks for Daniel to realize that assumption was backwards. Nathan understood the relationship between torque and joint placement almost intuitively. He would stare at a servo motor for a long stretch of silence, not answering when Daniel spoke to him, and then suddenly announce a specific measurement change that turned out, upon testing, to be exactly right. Daniel started keeping a small notebook, not for the project specs, but for moments like that. He didn't know why he did it at first. Later he understood it was because he wanted a record somewhere of exactly how good his son was at this. In case anyone ever doubted it, he had a feeling, even early on, that somebody would. The whispering started small, the way these things usually do. It began at pickup, outside the elementary school, where parents clustered near the fence, waiting for the bell. Daniel wasn't part of that cluster generally. With Daniel wasn't part of that cluster generally. He came straight from work in his coveralls, hands still faintly smelling of machine oil, and he didn't linger to chat. But he heard things anyway. You always hear things, even when you're not trying to. One mother, a woman named Carol Hensley, whose son was also entering the science fair, a considerably simpler volcano and baking soda affair, had apparently been telling other parents that Nathan's project sounded like something Daniel was building for him. "That's not really fair to the other kids," she reportedly said. "If the dad's basically doing an engineering degree's worth of work in the garage and just letting the boy take credit." Daniel heard this secondhand from another parent who felt he ought to know, delivered with the kind of awkward, apologetic tone people use when they're passing along something unpleasant but feel obligated to. He did not respond to it. He did not go find Carol Hensley and correct her. He did not post anything online, defend his son on the school parent forum, or bring it up with the teacher. He went home, and he asked Nathan how the shoulder joint mounting was coming along, and Nathan showed him a revised bracket design that solved a wobble problem they'd been fighting for a week. And Daniel thought, privately, that Carol Hensley had clearly never spent 5 minutes actually watching her own assumption in action. He let it go. Or he tried to. It came up again a few weeks later, more directly this time, at a school event where parents were asked to give a brief update on their child's fair project. Daniel had come along at Nathan's insistence, though Nathan himself did not want to speak in front of the group and had asked his father beforehand to just say, "It's going well," and nothing else. Daniel had honored that. He'd said exactly 6 words about the project when his turn came. Carol Hensley, sitting 2 rows back, had not honored the silence that followed. She'd raised her hand, smiled the kind of smile that pretends to be friendly while doing something else entirely, and asked whether it was really appropriate for a parent to be, quote, essentially running the entire build. The room had gone a little tense. A few parents looked at Daniel. A few looked at their laps. Daniel did not raise his voice. He did not defend himself with a long explanation. He said, "My son designed it. My son is programming it. I am the person who drives him to the hardware store." Then he sat back down. Nobody said anything else about it that evening. But Daniel understood, walking out to the car afterward with Nathan quiet beside him, that the whispering had not stopped. It had just gone underground, the way water does. When you dam it somewhere, it doesn't want to be dammed. He decided it didn't matter. What mattered was in the garage. The months that followed were the best and hardest of that entire year, in Daniel's estimation, though he never said so out loud to anyone but occasionally wrote it, in different words, in the small notebook. They hit real problems. Not the fake kind of problem you invent to make a story sound harder than it was, but the actual grinding 3 nights in a row kind of problem that makes you question whether the whole thing is even possible. The gripping mechanism at the end of the arm failed constantly in the early builds. It would grip an object fine on the bench but drop it the instant the arm moved, because Nathan's original design hadn't accounted for the shift in center of gravity during motion. Nathan did not get frustrated the way some kids might, with tears or shouting. He got quiet, rocked a little faster, and stared at the failed grip for what felt to Daniel like an uncomfortably long time. Then he said, "It's not the fingers. It's the wrist." Daniel didn't understand what he meant until Nathan pulled up the design file and pointed at the wrist joint, showing how the rotation point was slightly offset from where it needed to be to keep the object's weight centered during transport. It took them 4 more days to redesign the joint and rebuild it from scratch. When it finally worked, Nathan didn't cheer or smile the way another kid might. He simply nodded once like he'd confirmed something he already suspected, and said, "Now the sorting logic." Daniel remembered laughing out loud at that. Barely finished one impossible problem, and already on to the next. That was Nathan, though. He didn't celebrate the way you'd expect. His satisfaction lived somewhere quieter, somewhere Daniel had learned to recognize in small signs. A particular stillness, a slight easing of the shoulders, a returning focus to the next task without any lingering need for praise. Daniel gave him the praise anyway, every time, because he figured somebody should, even if Nathan didn't need it to keep going. The sorting logic took the longest of anything. Nathan wanted the arm to identify objects by size using a basic camera sensor and sort them into different bins accordingly, without any manual input once it started running. This meant programming, real programming, the kind that involved actual code, rather than drag-and-drop blocks meant for kids his age. Nathan had taught himself the basics from library books and free online tutorials months before the project even started. A fact Daniel hadn't fully appreciated until he watched his son debugging actual syntax errors at 10 years old with the patience of someone twice his age. There were nights Nathan got stuck for hours on a single error, one that turned out eventually to be a missing semicolon buried in 40 lines of code. Daniel watched him work through it without interfering, because he'd learned early on that helping too much wasn't help at all, not for Nathan, not for this. He sat nearby instead. He brought snacks Nathan wouldn't eat until he was done. He said nothing when nothing needed to be said, and that, more than any technical contribution, might have been the most important thing he did across those 6 months. Somewhere around month 4, Daniel started getting calls from the school again, this time not from parents, but from Nathan's teacher, a woman named Ms. Alvarez who taught his gifted resource class twice a week. He expected another version of the same complaint, dressed up in more official language. Instead, Miss Bame. Alvarez told him she'd looked over the project proposal Nathan had submitted for the fair, and she wanted to make sure Daniel understood what he was looking at. "This isn't a normal science fair project," she told him over the phone. "This is graduate-level work being attempted by an 11-year-old, and I want to know how much of this is really coming from him, not because I doubt you, but because I need to know how to support him properly going forward." Daniel appreciated the honesty of the question, even if it echoed the same doubt he'd been fielding from less well-meaning sources. He told her the truth. He told her about the sketch on the worksheet, about the wrist joint redesign, about the semicolon error that took Nathan 6 hours to find because he refused help. Miss Alvarez was quiet on the line for a moment. Then she said, "I'd like to come by. If that's all right, I want to see it in person." She came by the following Saturday. She stood in the garage doorway for a long time, watching Nathan calibrate the arm's grip sensitivity through a laptop interface he'd built himself, adjusting values, testing, adjusting again, murmuring numbers under his breath the way he did when he was deep in focus. She didn't interrupt him. She watched for almost 20 minutes before she finally turned to Daniel and said, quietly, "So he doesn't build like this at school. He shuts down the second. There's a group project involved." Daniel said, "He doesn't need a group. He needs quiet and enough time." Ms. Alvarez nodded slowly, like she was filing that away for later. She said she'd make some adjustments to how she structured his classroom work going forward. Before she left, she paused at the car and told Daniel something that stuck with him for the rest of the project. "Most people are going to see the fidgeting and the way he won't look at them and decide that's the whole story. It's not even a chapter, it's a footnote." Daniel thanked her. He didn't say much else. But that sentence rattled around in his head for weeks afterward, because it was the first time since the project started that another adult had said out loud the exact thing he'd been thinking in private for years. Competition day arrived on a bright Saturday morning in early spring at the regional convention center that hosted the district's science fair every year, a cavernous space filled with trifold poster boards, baking soda volcanoes, and the occasional overachieving app prototype. Daniel and Nathan arrived early. They always did, because Nathan needed time to set up without the pressure of other people watching him do it. They found their assigned table, unpacked the arm from its padded transport case, and began the careful process of connecting cables and running system checks. Nathan did not speak much during setup. He rarely did before something important. He moved through the steps methodically, the way he'd practiced 100 times in the garage, checking each joint's range of motion, confirming the camera sensor was calibrated to the competition lighting, running a test, sort with a set of sample blocks he'd brought from home. Daniel stood back and let him work. He always let him work. Around them, other families were setting up more conventional projects, and Daniel caught a few curious glances toward their table as the robotic arm came together, its aluminum frame catching the overhead lights, servo motors whirring quietly as Nathan ran through his final checks. He also caught, out of the corner of his eye, Carol Hensley, several tables down, helping her son adjust a poster board with slightly more visible effort than perhaps she intended anyone to notice. He didn't think about her for more than a second. There wasn't room in his head for anything but Nathan that morning. The judging began at 10. 3 judges moved from table to table in a rotation, spending anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes at each project, depending on complexity, asking questions, taking notes on clipboards, nodding politely at volcanoes and circuit boards alike. Daniel watched them work their way down the row, gradually approaching their table, and felt something tighten in his chest. That had nothing to do with doubt in Nathan and everything to do with worry over how the judges might treat him. He'd seen it before, at school events, at doctor's appointments, at birthday parties. Adults who didn't know how to talk to Nathan sometimes defaulted to talking over him, addressing questions to Daniel instead, assuming the boy standing quietly beside the project was somehow separate from the achievement itself. He hoped for Nathan's sake that these judges would be different. They arrived at the table a few minutes past 11, 3 of them, dressed in matching lanyards, the lead judge, a woman in her 50s named Dr. Patricia Kwan, a mechanical engineering professor from the State University, who chaired the regional judging panel every year and had a reputation, Daniel had heard, for being difficult to impress. She looked at the robotic arm for a long moment before saying anything. Then, she looked at the title card Nathan had made, describing the project in his own words. Typed and printed, because his handwriting under stress wasn't always legible even to him. She looked at Nathan. Less. So, she said, "Walk us through what this does." Daniel felt his stomach clench, an old familiar reflex ready to step in if Nathan froze or the judge's patience ran thin. Nathan did not freeze. He reached for the tablet mounted beside the arm, tapped it awake, and began speaking in the flat, precise cadence he used when he was fully inside a subject. He understood completely. "This is a 6-axis robotic arm," he said. "It uses a camera sensor to identify objects by size and shape, and it sorts them into 3 bins without a person controlling it after it starts. I designed the joints, and I wrote the sorting program myself." Kwan's eyebrows moved slightly. 6-axis. That's a significant number of degrees of freedom for a project this size. Nathan nodded. The wrist joint took 4 days to redesign, because the first version put the pivot point in the wrong place, and it dropped things when it moved. He then, without being asked twice, walked them through the joint layout, pointing to each motor in turn, explaining the range of motion it needed to achieve, and why he'd chosen the gear ratio he had for each one. One of the other judges, a younger man with an engineering firm's logo on his lanyard, asked what the tolerance margin was on the gripping mechanism, clearly expecting either silence or a guess. Nathan answered with an exact number, then added that the number had been arrived at through 11 separate test iterations, because anything looser caused slippage on smooth surfaces and anything tighter risked crushing softer materials. The judge glanced at Dr. Kwan. Dr. Kwan did not glance back. She was watching Nathan. She asked about the sorting logic next, specifically how the program distinguished between similarly sized objects. Nathan pulled up a portion of his code on the tablet, scrolled to the relevant section, and explained the thresholding values he'd set, admitting openly that his first version had misclassified objects near the boundary values until he added a secondary size check that cross-referenced 2 measurements instead of 1. Then he added something nobody had asked for. "I want to add a 4th bin next year, for irregular shapes, but I haven't solved the rotation problem for the camera yet." Dr. Kwan wrote something down. Daniel could not see what. She asked one more question, the one that made the room shift, even if nobody but Daniel and perhaps Ms. Alvarez, who had come to watch and was standing a respectful distance away near the aisle, fully understood why. She asked, and I mean this as a genuine question, not a test, "Did your father build any part of this with you?" Nathan considered the question with the same seriousness he gave every question, pausing to think, before answering rather than rushing to please. "He helped me get parts," he said. "He drove me to the store. He didn't tell me the answers when I got stuck. I had to find them." He looked toward Daniel, briefly, the closest thing to eye contact he tended to offer, and added, "He just stayed with me while I did it." Dr. Kwan looked at Daniel for the first time since they'd arrived at the table. Daniel said nothing. There was nothing to add to that sentence that wouldn't have made it smaller. The judges stayed at their table for nearly 20 minutes, well beyond the usual rotation, asking follow-up questions that grew more technical as they went, questions about power distribution, about the microcontroller's processing limits, about what Nathan would change with more time and a bigger budget. Nathan answered every single one without hesitation, occasionally correcting a judge's assumption about how a component worked, always politely, always with the same flat certainty. By the time they moved to the next table, a hush had settled over the surrounding area, the kind that happens when a room slowly realizes it has been watching something more significant than it initially understood. Daniel noticed Carol Hensley standing near her son's volcano display, watching the judges walk away from Nathan's table with an expression that had shifted somewhere between skepticism and quiet reassessment. She did not come over. She did not apologize. Daniel had not expected her to, and he found somewhat to his own surprise that he did not need her to. What he needed was standing right next to him, quietly repacking the sample sorting blocks into their case, already thinking about the 4th bin and the rotation problem for next year. The results were announced 2 hours later, in the main hall, with the fair's coordinator reading names off a card, while families gathered in loose clusters near the stage. Nathan did not like crowds, and had asked, beforehand, whether they could stand near the back where there was more room and fewer people pressed close on all sides. Daniel had arranged exactly that, scouting the room earlier for the spot that gave Nathan the clearest path to step forward if his name was called, and the clearest path to step back if it got to be too much. 3rd place went to a water filtration project from a middle school across town. 2nd place went to a solar-powered irrigation model that the crowd applauded warmly. 1st place, the coordinator said, reading from the card with what struck Daniel as genuine enthusiasm rather than routine politeness, goes to a robotics project so advanced our judging panel asked me to specifically mention that it exceeded typical standards for this competition level. Nathan Foster, for his autonomous sorting arm. The applause that followed was not the polite, obligatory kind. It went on a beat longer than the previous rounds, and Daniel heard, somewhere in the crowd behind him, someone say, "That's the one from earlier, the kid who explained it all himself," in a tone of genuine surprise that had shed most of its earlier doubt. Nathan did not want to walk to the stage in front of that many people. He'd told Daniel as much beforehand, quietly, in the car on the way over, and Daniel had already spoken with the coordinator about it days earlier, arranging for Dr. Kwan to bring the ribbon and certificate down to him instead, at the back of the room, away from the press of bodies near the stage. Kwan walked over herself, ribbon in hand, and crouched slightly to Nathan's eye level rather than expecting him to look up at her. She said, "You did excellent work, real work. I want you to know the judging panel had a longer conversation about your project than any other one today." Nathan took the ribbon, looked at it for a moment, and said, "Thank you." Then, after a pause, he added, "I already know what I'm fixing for next year." Dr. Kwan smiled, an actual smile, not the professional kind she'd likely been wearing all day. She turned to Daniel next, and this was the part he thought about most. Afterward, more than the ribbon, more than the applause. She said, "I've judged this fair for 11 years. I've had a lot of parents try to take credit for their kids' work by hovering, by answering for them, by doing the talking themselves, so the kid wouldn't have to. What I saw at your table today was the opposite of that. I saw a father who clearly did nothing but give his son room to be brilliant. Daniel didn't have a practice response for that. He said, simply, he did the work. I just didn't get in the way." Kwan nodded, like that was exactly the answer she expected, and moved on to find the second-place family. They drove home a little after 2 in the afternoon, the ribbon sitting carefully on Nathan's lap, the sorting arm packed away in its case in the back seat, and the two of them mostly quiet, because Nathan had used up a lot of words that day and needed the quiet to recover. And Daniel had never needed a reason to give it to him. Somewhere around the halfway point, Nathan spoke without looking over. "Are you going to keep the ribbon, or should I?" Daniel said. "It's yours. You keep it." Nathan thought about that for a moment, then said, "We could put it in the garage, near the workbench, so I can see it while I build the next thing." Daniel said that sounded like exactly the right place for it. He didn't say much, else the rest of the drive, because there wasn't much left to say that the day hadn't already said for him. The whispering, as it turned out, mostly stopped after that. Not because anyone made a formal apology, and not because Daniel ever brought it up again, but because there wasn't much room left for doubt once 30 people had personally watched an 11-year-old explain torque ratios to a university engineering professor without notes. Carol Hensley never said anything about it directly. But at the following year's school event, when another parent made an offhand comment about a different kid's overly ambitious project probably being done by the dad, Daniel heard, through the grapevine, that she was the one who told them to actually watch the kid present before assuming anything. He never confirmed that story. He didn't need to. It fit the shape of the world settling back into place after being knocked briefly off balance, and that was enough. Per day. Alvarez restructured a portion of her gifted class curriculum that fall to include more independent, self-paced project work, specifically citing Nathan's process as part of her reasoning to the school administration, though she never mentioned him by name in the official proposal. She didn't need to. Daniel heard about it from her directly, over a cup of coffee she offered one afternoon when he came to pick Nathan up early for a dentist appointment. She told him, watching, "That kid work is the best professional development I've had in 15 years of teaching." Daniel didn't know what to say to that, so he just thanked her, the way he thanked most people who said something kind about Nathan, plainly and without embellishment, because embellishment always felt like it was reaching for something that didn't need reaching for. Dr. Bai. Kwan reached out a few months later, in early autumn, asking whether Nathan would be interested in a youth robotics mentorship program the university ran on weekends, specifically designed for kids who tested outside the normal boundaries of a typical classroom. Nathan said yes before Daniel had even finished reading the email out loud. The garage stayed busy through the following winter, this time with a new project taking shape on the workbench, something involving that fourth sorting bin and a rotating camera mount that Nathan had sketched out on the back of another worksheet, angle measurements included. Same as always. Daniel still came home most nights, smelling faintly of machine oil, still fixed industrial equipment for a living that didn't leave much room for error, and still sat quietly nearby while his son worked through problems that would have stumped most adults, saying nothing when nothing needed to be said. He kept the small notebook too. He still wrote in it, every so often, whenever Nathan did something that deserved to be remembered, somewhere permanent. The ribbon hung on a nail near the workbench, exactly where Nathan had wanted it, a little crooked, slightly faded from garage dust within a few months of hanging there. Nathan glanced at it sometimes while he worked, the way you'd glance at a compass, not for direction exactly, but for confirmation that he was still pointed the right way. Daniel glanced at it too sometimes when Nathan wasn't looking. He never needed convincing that his son was capable of exactly this. He'd known that from the first sketch on the back of a worksheet, angle measurements and all. What the ribbon confirmed, if anything, was something smaller and quieter than that, Something about rooms eventually catching up to what had been true the entire time, if you just gave them enough time and enough evidence and refused to raise your voice while you waited. He hadn't needed the room to understand any of it, not really. He would have kept showing up in that garage every single night, regardless, whisper or no whisper, ribbon or no ribbon, because that was never what the 6 months had actually been about. It had been about a boy who saw the world in angles and joints and tolerance margins that most people never noticed, and a father who understood, better than anyone watching from outside that garage door ever could, that the quietest kid in the room was often building something the rest of the room hadn't caught up to yet. The judges had gone silent that day because they were listening. Daniel had been listening the whole time.